Welcome to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth, horticulture educator with the University of Illinois Extension, coming at you from Macomb, Illinois, and we have got part 2 this week of our conversation with local foods and small farms educator Zack Grant. He is located up in southern Cook County, so the kind of the south suburban Cook County, and we continue our conversation about dealing with soil contamination. Zack gets into the details of how he, the many different ways that you can go about cap and fill, where we can kind of grow outside or on top of that contaminated soil. And then we dive into the importance of soil testing and the often overuse of compost. There is a lot of great information packed in today's show. So without further ado, enjoy.
All right, so we've kind of mentioned this quite a bit, but because of soil contamination, a lot of times in urban soils, we're going to be growing things differently, particularly edible crops because of that lead concern. And you've mentioned that cap and fill. Mm-hmm. So when you're capping that, you're putting something down over that potentially contaminated soil or less than ideal soils to grow in. Are you just using like a regular weed fabric, plastic, or are you using some kind of special fabric when you're doing that?
Great question. And it's something that as much as I've used different types of landscape fabric, there's like a whole other realm of these, what I call geotextile fabric barriers that, some of them are used. There's this classic one that I see a lot in urban agriculture in some of this in situ remediation. They call it the orange fabric. Like you may have, if you've seen road construction projects, you sometimes see they lay this material down before they, build other layers with their roadway. And I don't know what differentiates that necessarily with like in the background here, you can see that yellow lined landscape, traditional kind of woven, kind of more heavy duty, kind of 5-year UV resistant landscape fabric. The difference between that and like the orange geotextile fabric you see like in construction usage. I'm not enough of a material expert to know the exact difference, but I will say that, I think if you can, any sort of longer term landscape fabric that, roots when they hit it are likely not going to go through it, or it's going to kind of prevent or discourage roots from growing any further down. So in general, like this landscape fabric behind me for these sites that don't have a lot of contamination, where it's kind of borderline, we just kind of recommend that. Again, there are some specific geotextile fabrics that might be used for these applications, but it's sometimes hard to find and source those, whereas these, landscape fabrics are pretty easy to find in different sizes and different applications. So yeah, typically it would be the case where we evaluate the site first, figure out what maybe let's say lead in particular, the contamination level is. And if it's not too crazy high, but the soil isn't really that great to work with for other reasons, quality reasons, yeah, we would just recommend, throwing down landscape fabric like that. And then you have some options. You could, depending on your budget or your comfort level, you could just throw a raised bed on top of that, or like a berm bed on top of that, and just grow directly in that. What we did at our site is we did landscape fabric at first, but then we put a big old pile of wood chips on top of that, like an 18-inch wood chip layer. And then on top of that wood chip layer, we built the beds out on top of that. And I've seen all sorts of different variations of this. And there isn't, I don't necessarily know that there's like one proper, like engineered way to do it, because it's kind of a new area of study in terms of production. So we've seen all sorts of different ways of doing it, but it's usually some sort of combination of, capping the potential contaminated layer and then bringing in different imported organic biomass kind of base material on top of that to grow in. I typically recommend, and we can talk about this too, is growers try to find, and a lot of landscape company or, landscape centers have this, or some compost suppliers specialize in this. You can get like a 50-50 compost topsoil blend. And usually the reputable ones, right, they test the compost, so you can get the compost test results, and they're hopefully sourcing and testing the topsoil too, right? So they can know they're giving you an uncontaminated product.
Hopefully.
So they're kind of starting from scratch, right? Oh yeah, hopefully. I did it. So where I'm at, I actually live in Kankakee County. We built a berm bed around our front yard, and I use this one landscape company all the time. And they have this like sand mushroom compost topsoil mix. And I called the guy up and I said, hey, where do you source your topsoil from? Do you get tested? And he gave me, without giving me the actual test results, which I would prefer, he gave me enough, information where I was satisfied. I actually tested it myself too and found that it was pretty good quality and not contaminated. And we bring that in. And so, it really depends on your budget too, like, and the size of your site, how you're going to do that, right? I think for a lot of the audience that the Hort team works with, you think about building these structured raised beds, right? Where you build like some sort of box dimensional raised bed, and then you fill that with something, right? Like we're talking about an imported media. But if you're doing it on an acre, the cost in wood alone is going to be really expensive. So that's where these kind of berm bed systems come in, where you kind of just mound the imported media and kind of make a raised bed. So it looks like a traditional market, maybe in soil, kind of slightly raised bed, but you're building it out of imported soil. So we've experimented that at our site and a few other sites, and a lot of different farmers do that. And that seems to work well. People often ask, well, how do you keep the material on site? Doesn't it just wash away? And that's a great question for a lot of different reasons. Well, one of them is because, you don't want the material to move away, off site. But two, that actually opens up this whole other topic we can talk about, which is the potential overuse of compost in some settings, because compost, especially manure-based compost, has a lot of nitrogen, has a lot of phosphorus in it. And not all of it's immediately plant available that season. So if any of that's moving off site, whether leachate or the material itself, that can create a problem and some eutrophication downstream problems. So we want to kind of factor all this together and consider that when we're putting these cap and fill raised bed systems in. And I'll just go ahead and share just really quickly so we can get a visual on this too. This is a fun little PowerPoint slide I put together to kind of illustrate this and many different options that you can look at, where that kind of, what we're looking at is 3 different colored layers. The brown layer on top is kind of the clean media soil compost. That orange line is that fabric barrier, whatever you use. And then that kind of checkered white layer is the contaminated soil, or maybe even in some cases, it might be like a blacktop or parking lot that rather than removing that, people are just growing right on top of that. So either way, you can see different combinations for what you could do. You could either just kind of bring a bunch of soil in and on top of a fabric barrier and try to grow in that. You could form some beds out of it. You could have maybe wood chip paths between that, or you could have like a wood chip barrier that you build the beds on top of. The one thing that this last little picture is seeing, and for listeners, I'll try to describe it, is the runoff and percolation. This is actually a kind of an unresearched area. It's starting to become more research, is what I should say. Because when we think about infiltration into the soil and kind of that groundwater or the leachate moving its way through the soil down towards the water table, in a rural soil, that whether it's well drained or not, like that's moving down. There aren't many restrictions other than maybe plow pans and compaction, but eventually that material is moving down. However, in urban areas, if we're growing on a compacted soil or on a parking lot or impervious surface, once that leachate hits that impervious surface, where's that water go, right? It's gonna move horizontally at some point. So there's an issue with that, with the storm drain runoff and all these potential nutrients leaching off into that. So there's a whole sub issue with the use of compost in urban settings as it relates to like the nutrient loss reduction program, which, in talking to our colleagues in that space, my understanding is that urban runoff only accounts for, I think it's like 7 to 10% of the nutrient loading concerns for like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. But I've seen some new research out there, and it's kind of staggering. It's a little bit of modeling, a little bit of field research that suggests that some of the compost application rates that are seen in urban farms and gardens could account for as much as 30% of the phosphorus budget for that runoff of that 7 to 10%, right? Again, I'm not saying that using compost is bad, because it's not. I love compost. We all use compost, but we might just need to be a little more careful about how we're using compost, especially in these urban areas where we're kind of importing a lot of it, and that runoff may not have a place to go if it's hitting a hard surface, right? So there's a few issues with that, with kind of building these, imported systems that, we're doing it potentially to avoid the lead contamination, but we may be creating this other inadvertent runoff problem and nutrient loading problem if we're not careful about it. So, again, it's not to say, I'm not trying to say compost is bad, because I'm a big fan of compost, and rightfully so. It has its place in a major way, but I don't think compost is a silver bullet, right? We often talk about in horticulture and farming, there are no silver bullet solutions. I don't think that we can rely on it for that, especially when we see the rates that some farms add it. And in the popular media, we see in these no-till systems, compost mulch systems, where people are adding 6-8 inches of compost every single year to these beds. And it's likely overkill. And I understand why they're doing it. There actually is a stoichiometric chemical reason why they're inadvertently doing it. But what they don't realize is that they're P-loading their soils. And if that phosphorus makes its way off-site, could be some problems. In fact, I've heard people make analogies to the European nutrient loading standards, that where they see some of the rates that urban farms and market farms apply compost at, they would be, fined like large amounts of euros for the amounts of, manure or compost they're adding, just based on nothing, right? A lot of times, like, I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with this, where like with lawn fertilization, for instance, like rather than just saying, oh, I'm going to apply my Scott's, 20-20-20, you're supposed to do a soil test first to see where your phosphorus levels are. And if your phosphorus levels are above where they need to be or optimum, you shouldn't be adding phosphorus in your lawn care program. So there's a lot of research and education around that for lawns, right, which makes up a huge acreage in the country. I'm not downplaying the issue potentially with lawns, but certainly we don't want to overuse compost. And all these really well-intentioned horticulturalists, we don't want to misuse a great resource like compost and get some of the same outcomes potentially. So,
Zach, it sounds like you're saying that everything in moderation is the way to go. And I feel myself, I will have a special penance later in life for early in my career, when I was just like, oh, you got a horticultural problem, throw compost at it. You got this issue, compost. So I wish I could go back in time and tell myself or the audience at that time, like, hey, no, compost, you can overdo it. Yeah. Everything in moderation.
Yeah, I agree with that. Everything in moderation. And maybe as a transition to another thing we can talk about is using data, right? Using soil testing and metrics you can actually visibly look at to help guide what you're actually applying, versus like, oh no, I've applied 6 inches every year and it works for me, and I'm just going to continue.
Yeah. And my neighbor does it, that works for them. So I'm just going to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can't blame them, because I mean, there is a kind of culture and ethos around using compost that, I think feels right. And actually physically is really gratifying to work in. Because if you've ever grown in these kind of imported mixes with high levels of compost in them, they're such a joy to work with in terms of ease of planting, ease of cultivation. You kind of create this almost instantly productive growing oasis instantly with these high compost systems. But again, there could be some downsides with that if we don't moderate it.
So you mentioned soil testing. So real quick,
yeah,
where can people go? How can they find out about testing soils? If they haven't listened to us in the past, maybe they'll listen to you.
Our well-developed soils website that we've been a part of and putting together. That's one resource that we can definitely link them towards. It's a bit of a challenge, Ken, because, as we all know, in Extension, as a land grant at Illinois Extension, we don't have a kind of public-facing soil testing lab that we can reliably send people to. So we kind of have to give them a bunch of commercial options or other land grant options, and then we can kind of provide those interpretive services potentially for them. So yeah, I would definitely recommend linking them to the labs that we link to on our website. You definitely want to find a lab that's easy to work with. That's kind of a pretty low hanging fruit thing to mention without recommending a specific lab. I work with a lab that has a really excellent online portal where I can kind of create an account. I can do anything from, getting the free soil sampling bags from them to printing shipping labels, anything that makes it convenient, right? And then, you send it off to them and then they give you the physical result like in a PDF, right? That's great. That's old school. But now they also put it in your account and you have a whole electronic database of all your soil data over multiple years, whether that's, lead contamination, your traditional soil test results. So if you can find a lab that kind of does that, that's kind of the new low hanging fruit in terms of public interfacing, public or customer engagement, customer service. The other thing you definitely want to look for is one, and I'm sure you've heard this before, maybe some in our audience have heard this, that you want to find a lab that, particularly for fertility nutrient testing, that does the testing that's applicable to soils in your area, right? So some of us heard of like, the Malic 3 versus Bray versus ammonium acetate versus there's lots of different types of soil testing for different cations and anions. You want to find the lab that's closest to what you have in kind of your local area and kind of stick with that lab, right? There's nothing wrong with like going to different labs, but sometimes they have slightly different analyzing, extracting procedures. So it can be an apples to oranges comparison. We like to say stick with the same lab. A lot of times people ask, well, what about the season, spring versus fall? A lot of times fall soil testing gets recommended because that's a time when you can see what the drawdown might be and maybe changes you can make over the winter. Like it was particularly with liming, like that's a big thing. Like if you need to lime your soils to bring pH back up to where it needs to be, if you apply that lime in the fall, you're probably guaranteeing some soil reaction to happen by the time planting comes around in the spring. I actually have a database of all my soil samples that I download from the lab that I use. And I just kind of track it all. Sometimes I do it in the fall and spring. But I just kind of track it all, the different management units, just to kind of look for trends in general. So, soil testing is one of those things. And I, at the Specialty Growers Conference that we're all just at, I was in a session, Dr. Melanie Stock from Utah State. She was giving this great presentation on cut flower fertility management, which there isn't a lot of good resources for that out there other than I think North Carolina and now her. She had this great analogy that I'm going to use from now on and feel free to use this widely because I think it's applicable. Soil testing gets a little bit of a bad rap because it's like, oh, it's more art than science. It's not very accurate. But what I would say is it's as an analogy, it's like, say you have a rec room in your basement and you have a dartboard, right? You go down to your dartboard in the basement and try to throw some darts at the dartboard with the lights off. And you might hit the dartboard every once in a while, right? But you're going to scatter it everywhere. You turn that light on, right? You're going to hit that dartboard more often than not, right? You might not be very good at darts, but you're still going to hit that dartboard more than with the lights off. And soil testing is essentially turning the lights on. That's all it is. So we're not saying you're going to get an exact recipe for what you need to do with your soil, but it's gonna put you in the right direction potentially. And certainly one thing soil testing is going to do is it's going to save you time and money, because what you might find out is you have your soil nutrient levels and pH might be exactly where it needs to be. So you don't need to do anything at all, right? And that might be, $35 a year well spent versus trying to track down all these inputs and fertility plan you need to put in place. Typically, what I'm seeing with my soil results and some of this data we're collecting from urban farmers with Midwestern soils, a lot of times you really just need to manage nitrogen. Like you have everything's in place. I mean, there might be some micronutrient deficiencies, maybe some cation imbalances, which we can talk about, but a lot of times nitrogen is all you need to manage for. And that can be a good thing because that's essentially something you can focus on, you can target, and you can, if you do it right and you set up a good plan, you can see good demonstrable results. I mean, I certainly get it for the home gardening set, how soil testing might be a little complicated, and in terms of actionable information, it might be confusing. But if anything, just to confirm that you might not need to do anything at all, like I think that's, again, if you're doing it once a year for $35 on average, I would say with shipping, I think that's money well spent. Certainly, with the commercial farmers we work with, we try to encourage a little bit more rigorous testing, which involves other things like, tissue testing and saturated media tests, some different, more extensive types of testing. But even for even just a backyard grower, I think, especially for vegetables, doing a soil test once per year isn't too much to ask.
And when you do that soil test, 90% of the people listening, watching, your phosphorus levels are going to be high or way more than you need. You can tell your lawn care company, stop putting phosphorus on my lawn.
Yes.
So say, give me a discount now that you're not putting all this phosphorus and probably potassium too. So this, as you said, for the most part, it's managing nitrogen. And I'll say on the random cases, and you probably deal with this more, Zach, with commercial growing than maybe Ken and I with home growers, is a lot of times calcium is also used in a lot of these fertilizers. And so maybe in like a commercial setting, you see an excessive amount of calcium in some of the beds. But soil test, please, don't throw your darts in the dark, turn on the lights.
There you go. You're already using the analogy to perfection, Chris.
I love it. I love it.
So yeah, that's a great point. I mean, you look at managing for nitrogen, and I think there are some scenarios where, as much as I hate to use the term, especially with the micronutrients and maybe even calcium in some cases, we set ourselves up for being able to kind of spoon feed the plants a little bit, which I know that gets a bad rap in terms of we want the soil to feed our plants, which again is happening, I agree with, and is a major part of a sustainable growing system. But soil testing really reveals that in order to optimize, there are some scenarios where inputs are needed, right? I think a great example, this analogy of mimicking nature, I think is a great one. It's not to say that there isn't a role for mimicking wild ecology with agricultural systems, but let's face it, the culture part of agriculture means it's not natural, right? It's human influenced. And in order for us to optimize what we're doing with the limited amount of time and resources we have, there likely are going to have to be some inputs involved, and nitrogen is the big one. So, I don't want to disappoint some of your listeners or say something that's controversial, but I think that, being a part of extension and trying to be data based, right? And we have to kind of look at all options. So I'm not against targeting nutrient inputs. In fact, that's a big, some of the push for the work moving forward is looking at that specifically, is looking at what's going on with urban growers and their soil levels right now, and what we can do to kind of make better recommendations moving forward. So yeah, it's I think it's really interesting. There's a great, I don't know. Yeah, I guess I can plug other extension folks. There's this wonderful blogger out there. His name's Andrew McGuire. He's I think he's an extension specialist at Washington State University. Check him out. He's got a really interesting blog that I think it's great, because what he does is he's a great writer, but he takes research information, right, and translates it, right, the kind of the work of extension in a really pretty easy to understand way. But he really gets down to the brass tacks. He's not looking to go with one dogma or the other, very conventional on one side or super organic natural farming system. He's just like, what does the research tell us? What's practical and applicable for farming systems like currently, right? Because there's a lot of really interesting, what I call basic science research out there about, looking at soil diversity and soil biota and its role in ecology, right, and natural ecosystems. But how that applies to agricultural systems is not super clear at this point, right? So, and there's a lot of overlap, right? There's, in fact, conventional agriculture is like, in a lot of ways, has moved more towards the middle, if not adopting some of these ecological practices that are very practical versus like what we might have thought 20, 30 years ago, where it's just like, spray, 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 urea. There is a lot of adoption of, good, decent long rotations, using cover crops, supporting soil biology up to a point where we know it's applicable versus like, only focusing on soil biology, right?
Mm-hmm.
As
compost, only compost,
right? It's the three-legged stool we teach in soil quality, right? It's not just physical, chemical, or biological. It's all three kind of working together. So, and I think traditional soil testing gets a bad rap because it kind of looks at primarily the chemical sphere. But there's just a wealth of good data that backs that up, right? If we have nutrient limitations for crops and we can increase the nitrogen levels they're exposed to, we get higher yields. And if we're trying to grow more food for more people, then that's, we might have to adopt some of that is all I'm saying. So, I didn't want to get too controversial, but I get going down this path sometimes, and it's.
I'll just forward all of those emails to you that we get.
Certainly, and I'd be open to the dialogue and having the conversation. That's I think what we try to do here, and that's what science-based kind of work is. We know what we know currently, and if it changes with different results, then that's part of it.
Yeah, I think kind of the amazing thing, and every time I talk with, experts in a field like you, Zach, and entomologists, pathologists, I realize we are just kind of starting out in this scientific exploration. Like people will, maybe our generation hasn't really had to think much about lead issues, but just a few years before I was born, they figured out, oh, lead's bad. Let's take it out of stuff. So this is new stuff. The cap and fill demonstrations that you're showing, this is new science. This is new work that we're still figuring out. We know that it applies to broadly to a lot of sites, but how does it apply to a specific commercial farm, home garden? That's kind of where extension comes in, and we figure out how that research and how that can apply more into those diverse real world situations. So it is a dialogue that needs to happen.
In terms of big take home messages with urban soils is, like we've already discussed, do a site assessment first, right? Figure out what's going on. Even if you're in a suburban area or you're not totally sure, kind of get out there, kind of dig in your soil profile, not too deep. You don't want to have to call Julie, right? Or maybe call Julie if you need to dig a soil pit to figure this out. And just kind of figure out what's going on and figure out the history of your site. And then that's going to lead you down the path of, do I need to do heavy metal testing? And then certainly I'm definitely encouraging all farms to do the standard fertility soil testing to start. And, that there's another pathway of complexity there that we in extension can certainly help out with. Right. So it's, you're not in this journey alone. This is what we're here for, is to help you with that. So definitely reach out to us who work with soils and we can, do our best to assist you with the time and resources we have. So yeah, I think that's kind of the big take home message with all of it.
Well, that was a perfect way to sum that up. I loved how we just recapped that. So thank you very much. Yeah, so that was a lot of great information about soil contamination, and we really dove into soil fertility and soil management there at the end. So this is a delightful conversation. I think we need to. Well, part 2 coming up. Soil. Yeah, we're talking. All right, now we've established soil contamination levels. We've established what type of soil type you're going to bring in or work with. Now it's long term, so that's like part 2 podcast. We'll put that in the works. Yeah. Well, the Good Growing Podcast is a production of University of Illinois Extension, edited this week by me, Chris Enroth. A special thank you, local food small farms educator Zack Grant. Thank you so much for being on the show today. We really do appreciate chatting with you about your work in soil contamination and fertility.
My pleasure. Anytime.
And another special thank you, Ken Johnson. Thanks for hanging out with me once again, as always, every single week, and chatting about the dirt beneath our feet. You are the wind beneath my wings, Ken. Thank you very much.
You're gonna get hate mail over the dirt now.
I know. It's not dirt, it's soil.
And thank you, Zach. I think we need to have another podcast on how do you wash soil. Anybody listening does that as a job.
Let's look into that. It'll be like the Dirty Job show. We'll figure out who that is.
Yes. We'll get them on. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And let's do this again next week, Chris.
Oh, we shall do this again next week. We're going to be chatting with Emily Swihart about a brand new project that we are going to want our listeners and viewers to participate with us in. What is that? Well, we will announce it next week. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm excited to get that on the track here. So listeners, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing.